Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We are going to give it about a minute or two while folks log on, and we'll get started in just a minute. Thanks so much. Well, we still have some folks logging on. I'm going to go ahead and get started with just a few housekeeping notes. First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here as we unveil our new report on the early childhood education profession, specifically in childcare settings. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Your video is automatically turned off and you're muted, and in fact, you couldn't even turn them on if you wanted to. So you'll be watching this webinar in the peace and quiet of not being able to be seen or heard, so no worries about that. You can feel free to use the chat box function, which you should see on the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions or comments that you want to pass along throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them in there. We'd love to hear feedback and learn more about what's most interesting to you. The webinar will be recorded, so after we finish up today, we'll work on getting that uploaded, and then you'll receive an email later this afternoon or tomorrow morning that has the recorded webinar. It'll have a link to the report, and it'll have any additional links that were shared during this call. So if you miss the link that's shared in the chat box, no worries, we'll get that to you later. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started by introducing myself. My name is Julia Honer. I'm the Communications and Development Director at Groundwork, Ohio, and I've been spearheading our policy work specifically on the early education and health workforce. So today we're kicking off with our first kind of report in this space that focuses on childcare settings in Ohio. This is the first report to be released with state-specific data in Ohio since 2013. So we're excited to learn about the ways we have advanced in the profession and some of the challenges that we're still facing. So Groundwork's mission, if you're not familiar with us, is to champion high quality early learning and healthy development strategies from the prenatal period to age 5 so that we can lay a strong foundation for Ohio kids, families, and communities. Obviously, the workforce fits in very closely with our mission because we know if we're not supporting the adults in the classroom or the adults in the doctor's office or the adults in the home that are supporting young children, we can't begin to think that we're going to transform outcomes and better support families. So we know, especially in childcare, which is the system, it's probably the largest system outside of our state's Medicaid system that's reaching young children, it's critical that we support and advance those professionals that are in those settings. So a little bit about the report before we get to dive into all the nitty-gritty data. This report emerged from work that started long before, but was really kind of, the ground was broken on our early childhood race and rural equity work in 2018. We released a 212-page report that explored a whole host of different metrics about disaggregated data ranging from the prenatal period through post-secondary attainment that really showed gaps emerge earlier than public policy reflects, and that those gaps tend to persist or even grow throughout a child's life. One of the findings from that report, as we took the data on the road and talked to early childhood educators and other professionals in the early childhood space, was that if we really want to support children in the earliest years and work to close those gaps, we have to be supporting the early childhood education workforce. So that kind of finding and piece is also included in a follow-up equity report that was released just a couple of weeks ago, and that link will be in the chat box if it's not already. But this work really stemmed from one, wanting to provide the best quality care for young children, but also realizing that if we truly want to advance equity in the state of Ohio, we also have to be focusing on our workforce. The goal of the report is to really kind of lay a foundation and start a conversation around how we can advance the workforce in the state. These conversations are not new. They've been going on long before I ever entered this field, but what we do know is here in Ohio and across the country, what we hear is people constantly having the same conversations over and over and really struggling to move things forward. So this is our next step in moving things forward and talking about the ways in which we can better advance the profession, in the hopes that these conversations can lead to some real policy changes and investments in the coming years. The data included in the report, for the most part, unless otherwise indicated, and when you look through the report, there's all sorts of citations, you can figure out where things are coming from, but is the statewide data on our professionals is from the Ohio Professional Registry, which is a centralized information system for early childhood educators. And a big thank you to our friends at Okra who helped us pull all this data, sift through it, and figure out what it was saying. So thank you to all of you. The data is also reflective of fiscal year 19. So as you'll be looking through this, a lot of the data, well, all of the data included is pre-COVID data. And I mention that because while we know nothing's gotten better for the workforce during COVID, a lot of those challenges are exacerbated. There are some slight differences in the data, we assume, based on the impact of COVID-19. So with that, I'm going to dive right in and start by looking at who are Ohio's early childhood professionals. We know that like in most states, or all states, I should say, 95% of our child care professionals are female. This is a female-dominated profession. We have nearly 73,000 professionals who worked in Ohio child care programs in fiscal year 2019. And the median age for an early childhood education professional in the child care setting is 37. We'll dive into this education and degree attainment data a little bit later, so I won't go too far into that right now. We also know that Black women are disproportionately represented in our workforce, our early childhood education workforce in Ohio. So 28% of early childhood educators in the child care setting are Black women. That's 28%, despite Black Ohioans only making up about 13% of our state's population. And the percent of Black women that have been working in the field has pretty dramatically increased since 2005. So what does an early childhood professional do? Probably for most folks on this call, you don't need me telling you what an early childhood educator does. In the report, we have breakdowns for different positions, but if we just look at a teacher, the duties that are listed here are not simple ones. Those are pretty complex things that we're asking someone to do on a daily basis. But we also need to think about the other duties as assigned portion of an early childhood education professional's job, because oftentimes, while it's not specific words listed in a job description, that piece of the work really takes up a lot of their time, a lot of their effort, a lot of their energy, and is what impacts young children. The best educator we know is one that develops genuine and nurturing relationships with kids, and that just can't be captured in a bullet point on a job description. We know that early childhood educators play a really crucial role in children's development, and that public policy hasn't always reflected that. So brains are not just born, kids are born with unlimited potential, but 90% of brain development happens in those first 5 years of life. Extensive research in brain science shows that when quality care and education is provided to children in the earliest years, when they have those responsive, nurturing relationships with adults, that the brain architecture forms stronger foundation for all later learning. So if we're investing in children and supporting them in the earliest years by having highly qualified, nurturing, responsive early educators in a classroom, that's going to set kids up for success. We also know that, like I said before, public policy has not always reflected what the brain science shows, that we have to invest in the earliest years, because once those gaps emerge, and by age 5, kids can be up to 2 years behind their peers, it's really hard to close that gap, and we see the gap either persist or grow in the later years. But if we can invest on the front end and in the earliest years, we can really provide more equitable outcomes for children. So when we think about children who are at highest risk in our state, children of color, children in the Appalachian region, investing in those earliest years is really a social justice and an equity issue for young children. But despite how important we know early educators are, there are some pretty significant challenges in the field. Obviously, poor staff compensation is a huge piece of that, and a lot of these other challenges stem from the low compensation. There are significant challenges finding degreed and credentialed staff, and we've also got some really high turnover rates in the field. So I'm going to start just by digging in a little bit to our compensation data. The average hourly wage for a lead teacher in the state of Ohio in a childcare setting is $11.09 an hour, and that's despite 52% of those lead teachers having a degree or credential beyond a high school diploma. For an assistant teacher, that hourly wage is $9.91. We also know that depending on what age classroom you're working in, there's some pretty significant differences in your hourly wage. So teachers in preschool age classrooms in childcare settings make an additional 30 cents per hour compared to our infant toddler classroom. So when we think about how we're investing in the earliest years and how important that prenatal to 3 period is, this doesn't necessarily reflect that. There's also some pretty significant disparities in compensation based on race, less so by ethnicity, but you'll see as we look through compensation, the highest being $12.18 and the lowest being $9 an hour. That's a pretty significant compensation difference, especially between if we look at the majority of our early educators in the system being white and African American. There's nearly $1 difference in compensation there. There's also pretty significant disparities based on program type. So whether someone's working in a licensed center, a type A or a type B family childcare home, and based on the step up to quality rating of the program. When we look at where early childhood educators in the childcare field are compared to other professions, there's some pretty interesting comparisons. The first, which you'll see in the report, is that early childhood educators in childcare settings in Ohio make less than parking lot attendants in our state. They make slightly less than fast food cooks, manicurists, receptionists, significantly less than security guards, and less than half of what a kindergarten teacher makes. So we know that compensation is not just an issue for the adults in the classroom, it's also a challenge for the kids. When teachers have low wages, it's not reflecting the important work that they're doing. It's also not reflecting the significant investments we've made in our childcare system. Because when early childhood educators lack financial security or have lower wages, work multiple jobs, and don't have health insurance, they're more likely to experience emotional exhaustion, which studies have shown don't just impact the teacher, it impacts the children in the classroom. So if we want the best outcomes for kids, we have to invest in and support the teachers as well. The second big challenge that we cited in the report is recruiting degreed and credentialed early childhood educators for the system. For folks who are in the field, we know that there's huge bleed at this point in COVID of educators from the field. Part of the challenges, even with recruiting those who have an early childhood education associate's degree or a CDA, is that compensation piece. Ohio has recognized the importance of degreed and credentialed teachers in a childcare classroom, and that's reflected in our Step Up to Quality Rating and Improvement System, where we have standards based on degree attainment or CPL, the career pathways that folks can use to get up to those Step Up to Quality Rating and improvement system standards. When we look at kind of where we are in the state as of the end of 2019, so the state, it may have changed slightly. We look at our 1 to 2 star rated programs. About 88% of assistant teachers and 62% of lead teachers, their highest degree is a high school diploma, compared to about 14% of lead teachers and 5% having bachelor's degree. When we look at our 3 to 5 star rated programs, there is a significant difference. Only 27% of lead teachers and 67% of assistant teachers have their highest level of education as a high school diploma, and 36% of lead teachers, 10% of assistant teachers have a bachelor's degree. So that's a pretty stark contrast between those two. Also, like I mentioned before about the lower wages in infant toddler classrooms compared to preschool age, and how that contradicts what we know about the brain science in the earliest years, we see the same thing with degrees and credentialing in infant toddler classrooms compared to preschool classrooms. One note I want to make as we talk about degrees and credentials and the challenges that programs have in finding individuals with degrees and credentials and then compensating them so they stay, is that we know that degreed and credentialed teachers have an impact on young children. And advancing the profession in this space means clearing the pathways for professionals to get those degrees and credentials and compensating them so that they have a livable wage and that they can stay in this career. This does not mean that we should be rolling back standards or sacrificing quality for kids. The last big challenge, which again stems from the compensation and degree and credentialing piece, is retaining highly qualified early childhood educators. So we know that a combination of low compensation, high stress, and a lack of recognition for this important work all contribute to a pretty high rate of burnout in the field, which then leads to a high level of turnover of early childhood education professionals in the setting. So we see that 1 in 4 professionals in a childcare setting leave their job each year. That's more than double what we see in our K-12 system. So we've flown through a lot of data. There's a lot more in the report that you'll be able to dive through, but I want to make sure that we have more time for our panel than me talking through something you can read. I do want to touch quickly on our recommendations. Where do we go from here? We know, like a lot of the challenges in our childcare system, there is no silver bullet to solving the compensation problem. But we do have 8 bullet points of recommendations that we know are kind of the next steps in Ohio that we need to take. These range from securing additional public investment so that we can increase compensation and benefits for early childhood educators. We know we need to solve some issues in the higher education space around career pathways, maintaining and increasing the capacity of a comprehensive professional development system, identifying additional opportunities for funding and strategic partnerships. In this workforce space, there are other dollars outside the early childhood space that we can be using to support our workforce. So exploring ways to do that. Again, committing to rigorous data collection, establishing policies that are tailored to support family child care providers who have a much different experience than a center-based provider. Ensuring that we're applying the principle of equity to Ohio's child care system, because we know this is a very diverse system and that it can increase equitable outcomes for children, but we also need to think about equity among our early childhood professionals. And then finally, working to build early childhood education professionals' power through a unified voice that can advocate and that can speak to the challenges that we're seeing in the field. And with that, before we get to our panel, I want to turn it over to Kim Tice from Ohio AEYC, who's going to speak briefly on the Power to the Profession movement. And this is a movement to really unify the field and rely on the field to make decisions about how to advance the profession. So Kim, I'm going to turn it over.
Well, thank you. I'm so grateful to be a part of this. My name is Kimberly Tice, and I'm the Executive Director of Ohio AEYC. We're the state affiliate for the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and our mission is to empower all who care for, educate, and advocate on behalf of young children. I'm excited to share with you a brief overview of the Power to the Profession initiative and the consequences to children and early childhood educators if we ignore the recommendations of the Power to the Profession and Groundwork's report. In an unprecedented show of unity, the unifying framework for the early childhood education profession was developed over the last 3 years by a task force of 15 leading national organizations and the early childhood educators they represent. And so for the first time ever, early childhood educators collectively and clearly defined the standards, qualifications, roles, supports, and compensation for members of their profession. The unifying framework simultaneously calls for significant increases in federal and state investments to ensure that young children, families, businesses, and the economy are well served by an effective, well-prepared, and well-compensated profession. The framework is clear that as policymakers respond to the complex science of early learning by raising expectations and educational requirements for early childhood educators, the United States must simultaneously fund the necessary supports and provide increased compensation that reflects the value, importance, and return on investment generated by early childhood educators' highly skilled work. As Julia identified, there are real challenges in our current system. As a result of our nation's failure to adequately invest in high-quality childcare over the years, children are not getting what they need, families are paying more for childcare than housing, and the workforce is paid so little that nearly half live in families that depend on public assistance. To respond to the indefensible situation of low compensation that's undermining quality and driving early childhood educators out of the field, the profession established recommendations in which compensation for early childhood educators with comparable qualifications, experience, and job responsibilities to be at least comparable to public school salaries and comparable across all settings, include an adequate benefits package, and is not differentiated on the basis of ages of the children served. Power to the Profession is first and foremost about young children. It's our field's way of ensuring that early childhood educators are able to support the development and learning of all young children. And we can't do that if we don't talk about compensation. The deep need for increased investment to address educator compensation cannot come on the backs of families or early childhood educators themselves. Despite research that confirms that better paid teachers provide better quality care and that the teacher shortages are driven by low compensation, as Groundwork's report shows, compensation remains too low for everyone. Requiring higher qualifications without higher compensation has meant that educators are keeping their end of the bargain by meeting higher quality standards and completing degrees, but they are still earning poverty level wages. The goal at the heart of the Power to the Profession initiative is ensuring that regardless of setting, each and every child experiences the benefit of receiving these experiences from well-prepared and well-compensated early childhood educators who are recognized and valued for the importance of their work. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Dr. Junlei Lee from the Harvard School of Education, who says, "We can't make a lasting impact on children by skipping over the adults in the middle." Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Groundwork, for this report.
There we go. Thanks so much, Kim. We really appreciate you sharing that and all of the work that you're doing around the Power to the Profession. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists for the day to start what I'm most excited about. Today, we have joining us Deborah Brathwaite. She works with Dayton Montgomery Preschool Promise and has been working on creating a pathway model in Dayton that really focuses on supporting our early childhood education professionals with the compensation benefits that are reflective of the work they're doing. State Senator Stephanie Kunze is on with us today, who not only has been focused on our early childhood education space, but also is on the State Workforce Development Board. And then Kimberly Tice will be joining us. Thanks, Kim, for filling in. We had to make a last minute change because our child care provider who's supposed to be joining us had some things come up at her program. So Kim, who has an extensive background in early childhood education beyond her work at Ohio AEYC, is going to be joining us. I just want to start by having everyone introduce themselves. We'll go ahead and stop sharing the PowerPoint. And Kim, do you want to give you already introduced Ohio AEYC, but let's learn more about you. What's your background in early childhood?
Sure. Prior to joining Ohio AEYC, I had a 20+ year career in early childhood education as a family child care provider myself, a teacher, center director, Head Start, early Head Start, did a little bit of everything everywhere. And so I bring that experience with me, and I hope today I can honor the work of those who are directly in the field providing the most critical services to children and families.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Kim. Deborah, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you're doing and your experience in the field? Oh, can you hit unmute, Deborah? Sorry about that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Dr. Deborah Brathwaite. I am a retired educator who has served as a deputy superintendent in New York City, Cleveland, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Columbia, South Carolina. So I've moved around a lot. Currently, I am the Preschool Promise Del Mar Encore Fellow through the Dayton Foundation. My role is to build a workforce pathway to increase the number of qualified teachers and to build a wage stipend program to address inadequate wages and to increase the retention at childcare sites, very much what you've outlined in the report. I'm new at this, and it should be quite interesting. As an administrator in pre-K-12 settings for my entire career, I'm keenly aware of the importance of a quality preschool experience for our youngest learners. Very often the focus is on high school graduation, but my philosophy is that you can guarantee a student's graduation from high school if they had the benefit of a quality preschool experience. This quality experience is dependent upon the quality of the workforce, as everybody knows. And this profession is often under-resourced and underappreciated. So early childhood educators need to be well-trained and well-compensated in the work that they do, because not everyone can develop and nurture young minds. This is not something that you just walk off the street and can do. Not everyone can do this work. I am committed to this work because I believe it is one of the most important things that you can do in society. And that's not hyperbole. It is true. It impacts every aspect of our lives. Providing quality preschool education is an investment in the future, especially for students of color who are often marginalized and may live in poverty. I know that developing a workforce that is diverse, well-trained, and able to climb a career ladder to higher wages will benefit the profession and absolutely benefit the children in our care.
Thank you, Deborah. You should just be leading this whole webinar, in my opinion. Thanks so much for joining us. Senator Kunze, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your work in this space?
Yes, thank you so much. And I agree with you. I'm really happy to be here with the distinguished panel this morning. I'm State Senator Stephanie Coonsey. I represent the 16th Senate District, which is the western portion of Franklin County. I'm serving in my first term in the state Senate. And I have had the pleasure and the honor to chair a couple of different commissions that deal with early childhood, specifically Infant Mortality Commission for Ohio, and also the Ohio Children's Trust Fund. I also serve as a member of the Governor's Workforce Transformation Board. And so I really view my work as a real holistic viewpoint from while we're making policy for the state of Ohio for Ohio's earliest learners, because, you know, once I think Dr. Braithwaite said it perfectly, the investment that we make early on is what's critical and crucial to achieving high school graduation, some sort of a degree, whether it's a certificate, going on to college, or being career ready. I really see that those two, my work in the early childhood space, really is reflective and not siloed at all from my role on the Governor's Workforce Transformation Board, or as my role as the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee. I feel like the investments we make early on for our youngest Ohioans really do pay off in the future, as she so eloquently stated. I will also add that, you know, one of the things I think that the key in childhood educators play is, as we're going to discuss, and as Groundwork's report really stated, and as Kim's quote really highlighted, the that middle portion of what does our workforce look like who are engaged with early childhood learning and care. And so I'm really excited to be a part of the panel today to kind of discuss some of the ideas that the report is going to drive as it comes to creating policy as we move forward in Ohio to really ensure that our youngest Ohioans are getting the quality and also affordability for the care that they need for their little brains to develop and be kindergarten ready, but also for the way that we can really elevate the workforce behind our workforce here in the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coonsey. We're so glad you were able to join us. And Senator Coonsey came right from Infant Mortality Commission to be here, so we're appreciative of your time. Well, let's start off by talking a little bit more about the role early childhood educators play in children's health and development. So why is it so important, and maybe Kim, I'll have you start us off. Why is it so important for us to have strong early childhood education professionals, especially when we look at our childcare settings? You're still muted, Kim, sorry.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, well, let's try it again. The research has shown this is just the most critical period of brain development for young children. And we've always known the critical and essential work that early childhood educators do to transform outcomes for young children and provide essential supports for families. And I think during the pandemic, this has just been elevated to a new level of understanding that businesses can't go forward, parents can't go to work without the supports that childcare provides. So it's twofold. It's both for the child as well as for the family. And I think that Walter Gilliam last week, when he released the report on the impact of COVID in childcare centers, he made the statement that this wouldn't have been possible without the Herculean efforts of early childhood educators. And they've been doing that every day long before the pandemic. And so I just think that now is the time. It's always been the time, but now is the time, if we're going to reopen our economy, if we're going to continue to focus on the best for young children and their families, that we have to address compensation and benefits and recognition for the work of the early childhood education field.
Thanks, Kim. And can Kim, or maybe you, Dr. Braithwaite, touch on, like, what is the difference between a warm body in a classroom and a qualified early childhood educator? What's the impact on kids, the impact on families?
Oh, um, uh, I think given what we know about brain science and how the brains of young children develop, it's critical that individuals who work in early childhood education have a strong background on how understanding how those brain pathways are created. And the influence of that is students create those pathways based on the relationships they have with their caregivers. And it's also based on the kinds of activities that those caregivers do and the environment that they create. And you have to have knowledge about that in order to be able to do that. And so the people in the profession have to know how to understand the different stages of development for children. They have to know how to develop those language skills for young children, because language and literacy are the foundation for all types of learning. And so we know that as a previous school administrator myself, I found that children who entered kindergarten who were unprepared usually did not have that early childhood experience. And sometimes people think that early childhood is about play, music, arts, and craft. And yes, that enters into it. But early childhood educators also teach kids about school, what school means, how you navigate school, how you problem solve, how you negotiate, how you socialize. So they do a lot of things that some children may not get at home, and very often don't get at home. They get exposure to language, they get exposure to experiences. They are just exposed to things that make them successful when they get to kindergarten. Some people think kindergarten is about play also, but it isn't. It isn't. And so building that strong foundation before children get to kindergarten is important. And it also helps and benefits children who, if they didn't have that experience, might have to get services in the special education department. And sometimes it could eliminate the need for some children to be identified with a disability if they've had that early childhood experience. So I think that's what's important.
Yeah, our early childhood educators are really doing it all. Senator Coonsey, I want to kind of bring you in on this topic. I think if you talk to any early childhood educator, any child care administrator, parents, you can see the tangible impact that a qualified early educator has on kids. I mean, with my own niece and nephew coming home and like learning new things or saying new things, or it's just every single day there's something new, and that's what really sets them up for success. As a policymaker, is this something you think is, you know, widely understood outside this space, or what steps do we need to take to be really hitting home the importance of the profession?
Yeah, it's a great question. I didn't mention this in my intro, but last year I was able to also play a role in going to the Early Childhood Fellowship and the National. I've also done some work with the National Council of State Legislatures, you know, bipartisan groups talking about the importance of the profession. And to your point, to your question, no, I think that's one of the challenges and one of the opportunities really for myself as a policymaker and for all of us to really join together and start educating our policymakers on the importance of the work that you're doing. I think too often, you know, we hear from not only in Ohio, but across the country, sort of a sentiment that early childhood caregivers are, you know, babysitters. And to Dr. Braithwaite's, I'm not so Braithwaite's point, I hope I'm saying that right, Doctor, you're fab. You're hitting on, you're so eloquent. You're hitting on all of the points, but to your point, it is so much more about the level of knowledge and sophistication and education that the caregiver, the teacher, the educator really has to provide. And we have such a short window. And that's the other thing I think I spend a lot of time talking to my colleagues about. There's such a short window when we look at the brain science for that development, for getting children to be ready for kindergarten. And then again, talking about all those other investments that we make as a state through the K-12 space and then beyond, as we're trying to prepare our children for workforce and that type of thing, higher education. We really, really need to be backing it up. We need to be backing up investments. You mentioned that I just came from chairing the Infant Mortality Commission, and we had a great presentation this morning from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. And, you know, really looking at these things are not siloed. So we were talking about brain science as it relates to babies born as victims, their mothers being a victim of domestic violence. And we see the brain science even then showing that babies born from trauma to their mother while they were in utero are already behind in brain development. And so we really need to start, I guess, elevating the conversation, making these linkages between how important having an early intervention from a high quality teacher in early childhood experiences in pre-K, from the time that they're, you know, basically put into childcare to the time they reach kindergarten and then beyond. But those are really the critical years. And I don't think that conversation or maybe that level of knowledge across the board for all stakeholders and policymakers is there yet. And so I think it's our job to continue to advocate and continue to push it forward, because really to have a healthier Ohio long-term, we're going to need to have healthier children and families. And that all begins at the beginning. It's harder to fix it later.
Definitely. So I'm going to turn this next question over to you, Dr. Brathwaite. How did we get here? I mean, the brain science is clear that early learning is so critical to everything that happens later. We know parents can't go to work without childcare. So not only are we laying the foundation for all future success, this kind of like the K-12 system does, provides an essential work support. You know, parents with school-age kids can't go to work if their kids are home, which we've seen during COVID. It's the same with childcare if you've got a 0 to 5-year-old. So how did we get here, Dr. Brathwaite? Why is compensation so low? Why isn't the profession valued? Big questions, I know, but let's see if we can hit on them at least a little bit.
The simple answer to this question is I don't know. But what we do know is that the role of an early childhood educator is undervalued, even though we know that educating young children requires significant knowledge skills. And this, as the senator said, this is a very short window, a very critical time from birth to age 5. That is not a long period of time, but that's when most brain development occurs. So I believe that generally people think, again, that preschool is about playtime, snack times, nap time. But early childhood educators have to have a skill set, even though they're getting paid less than manicurists, hairdressers, groundskeepers, and kindergarten teachers. So the question is, should their compensation be differentiated based on the age of the children they serve? And the answer, I can answer that question, no, it shouldn't be. I think also maybe because young children can't advocate for themselves, then who advocates for them? And they can't do it, so the adults have to do it. But you talk about a disconnect between what early childhood educators do and how they're compensated. And I did do a little research. I tried to find some answers because that's who I am. And I found that low-income families that most need quality programs can't afford to pay for them. They cannot come out of pocket and pay for the cost of childcare, even though they need it. Government-sponsored programs may be free for families, but taxpayers have to foot the bill, and taxpayers don't want to raise their taxes. to pay for early childhood education. Free programs sometimes increase poverty because they remove incentives to earn higher wages that may risk a family's eligibility for child care benefits. So that's an issue. In order for teachers to receive equitable wages, they need to complete different credentials or college degrees. And they have to take exams, assessments that cost money. So that's an additional financial burden on candidates. And even though we want people that are better prepared, they're caught in the middle between having to pay tuition, having to pay for tests and textbooks, and not making a living wage. How do you do that? And training and retaining entry-level paraprofessionals or assistant teachers is problematic. Some lack the transportation that they need, or they have inadequate language or educational skills, and they may not have the family support that they need to get the job done. Although these are reasons for the disconnect, it's still incumbent upon us to provide what children need at a young age. And I don't have an answer yet. Part of my job at Preschool Promise is to find an answer. Maybe one day I'll wake up with the answer, I don't know. But it's incumbent upon everyone in the community to have some impact on the response that we have around this.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, it does seem, when we look at our childcare programs and our early educators, it's just the odds being stacked against you at every turn. Kim, can you touch on this a little bit as well?
I'm sorry, I had a little bit of video. My internet went crazy, so I don't know if I'll repeat anything that was said.
Okay.
But we're talking briefly about how we got here. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
what's happening? How did we get here?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that came to my mind is historical, in that this has always been viewed as women's work, caregiving of young children, and historically also women of color work, and both have been devalued throughout our nation's history. And so to overcome, decades, centuries of that mindset, and during World War II, our country came together and understood that because men were in service, that they needed women in the workforce. And collectively, the government provided high quality childcare programs, not just a space for kids to go to. And that met the needs of the women, it met the needs of the children. And yet when the war was over, the investment in those programs went away, even though Eleanor Roosevelt said this identified the need was there and that there needed to be continuation of it. So I don't want to give everybody, a history lesson, but at the same time, it shows that we can come together as a nation and we can recognize this work as work of value. And that, when you talk about the work of women of color who are disproportionately affected by the low wages, by what they call a stratification of professional opportunities, that for the number of women in color who are in the early childhood education profession, as you move up the career pathway to lead teacher, to director, to policymaker, to whoever, that fewer and fewer women of color are present in those positions. And so that says to us that in everything that we do around advancing the early care and education profession, that we also need to make sure that it's equitable for all. As you started this webinar today, that this is a social justice issue for both gender and race. And I think we can't look away from that if we want to make sure that young children are learning from people who look like themselves, who understand their communities. And so I think all of this is an opportunity to provide a comprehensive response and build the whole system back better when we get to a place that hopefully the pandemic is in our rearview mirror. I don't have a date for that, but that's my hope.
Well, and I could not agree with you more, Kim. I really appreciated and loved your sharing of the history lesson, because as I was sitting here thinking, and during the previous question, the opportunity for COVID to really shine the light on the disparities that we have, the underfunded issues that we have in the early childhood space. To your point about we need teachers who are credentialed, who are where the government or is funding their path to getting those credentials and getting that certification or degree, whatever that looks like for the state. But also, that not only lifts the workforce, it lifts the workforce's children, it lifts the children that they're caring for. But I hope that history does not repeat itself and that we don't miss this moment. I think that's our job as being a voice, at least at the state level, in partnership with our federal partners and at our local level. I think it's a kind of a three-tiered way that we need to go at it. I know here in Franklin County, we have a commitment through Future Ready Columbus to really engage the community, business, other nonprofits and government to really say, what can we do to make sure kids are ready for kindergarten at the state level? We need to make investments, especially on the workforce side, to make sure that we have an educated and trained, workforce prepared. And then at the federal level, I think it's really almost an infrastructure issue again. And to your point about during World War II, really being able to fund those types of programs, and allow states and local partners to create these places for children that are elevating women, elevating families, elevating people of color all across our communities. These are the key things that we need to get together. And I hope we don't miss the opportunity after the crisis, after World War II, when it went away. I hope this really elevates this and we can continue to push it forward.
Well, we hope the same thing, and we're happy that you're on board as well, Senator Coonsey. I'll just add one thing that I did see in the chat box. There is a whole nother issue that I won't take us down this large rabbit hole, but the question of why early educators paid so little when childcare costs so much. So I know we only have 8 minutes left. I won't go down there, but I will say there is that Childcare Aware of America has a really great video on that if you're interested in learning more. There's also a small piece in the report on that. But we do know that this isn't a supply and demand type business, that there has to be some public investment for this to work, and we need more stable funding in the system. So with that, recognizing we just have a few minutes left, I'm gonna kind of pose our final question, our wrap-up question, and we'll have Senator Coonsey and then Dr. Brathwaite, and then Kim, you can close this out. But where do we go from here? You touched on this a little bit, Senator Coonsey, but this issue can seem really overwhelming, and it's got historic roots, it's got roots in systemic racism, and it seems like we're now at a critical point. So what are the next steps that we need to make? And maybe they're the first steps, or maybe they're the biggest steps, but if you had to say one or two things, what would they be?
I think I will go back to the opportunity for funding and the strategic partnerships. I think those two things, plus the continuing education of policymakers to understand this is an economic issue for the state. And it's also, it's a critical issue for Ohio's families. If we want to have strong families, we know that strong families build strong communities, and strong communities build a strong state. And so they're really not separate. All of these things that we've talked about this morning are really the foundation for a healthy community, a healthy family, and a healthy state. Is really a healthy child at the beginning. That 0 to 5 space, we can't miss the opportunity to invest in our youngest 0 to 5 Ohioans.
Thanks, Senator Coonsey. Dr. Brathwaite.
I think that at the local level, we need to have a marketing campaign about the efficacy of a workforce that has the skills to develop, nurture, and support our youngest learners, and how that work will strengthen, as the senator has said, strengthens our community. I also think we need to promote the idea that there is a return on investment when we support early childhood programs and the people who staff them, because in the long run, you will end up paying less for more costly interventions when children have deficits as they move through the grades. And as research tells us, effective early childhood programming can reach beyond the early years. It increases high school graduation, it can reduce teenage pregnancy, and it can reduce incarceration rates. So I think another strategy you could use is to, in order to close the compensation gap, is to provide child care workers with tax credits of some sort that as they obtain credentials and degrees, they get different levels of tax credits, and that might help. Not sure, but it's something to consider.
Yeah, that's something we've seen in other states, and we know, again, it's not the silver bullet, but a little can go a long way as well. Thanks, Dr. Brathwaite. Kim.
I'm going to take us back to what I first started with, power to the profession. And I started out telling Julia I was so excited about this call and this report because for probably about 8 or 9 years, I served as the chairperson for wage and compensation for a state committee. And we agonized and we worked and we came up with this idea and that idea. And we could never get the investment that was necessary to actually move the needle on this. And why I tell us to return to the power to the profession report, in my long career, over 40 years, this is the first time that I have seen a comprehensive set of recommendations that if you try to address compensation over here by itself, without addressing standards, preparation, public policy, then it is really hard to move it forward. But we also need, more than anything, the voices of those people who are in the profession themselves being respected and invited to the table as decisions are made because they know their profession best. And to give an element of hope as we end this, the nursing profession has a very similar pathway as early childhood educators do. A caregiving profession, anyone can care for you. They had to take long time to identify what their standards were, fight for it, and they now are a well-respected and well-compensated profession. So I think there's hope, but it's going to be complicated. It's going to take a lot of effort. And as Senator Coonsey said, I hope we make the most of this moment.
Thank you, Kim. That was a great note to end on, and thank you all so much. Well, before you go, I want to leave you with two very small, well, one very small and one a little bit less small action steps. The first is Groundwork Ohio has an early childhood leadership fellowship. This is a group of 30 individuals from across the early childhood space, so childcare, preschool, home visiting, early intervention, social work, anyone who is interacting with children and families from the prenatal period to age 5. A year-long fellowship program to foster leadership skills and learn more about advocacy and how you can work to advance things like the early childhood education profession. Our 2021 cohort application is open as of right now. It launched on the website. So if you're on and you're interested in being engaged in advocacy to advance things like childcare access, quality of childcare, the early childhood education profession, home visiting, whatever it is, I'd encourage you to check it out, learn more, and apply for the fellowship. That application will be open for the next month. And then our last piece is, we know as we work to advance equity in the state, and that as we work to advance our early childhood education profession, that we need to recognize the impact systemic racism has on outcomes for children and families. And if we're going to advance equity in our state, which is something that we've seen a commitment from our governor, we've seen a commitment from lots of policymakers like Senator Coonsey, local policymakers, there's movement on the federal level as well, that we need to really declare it for what it is, a public health crisis, recognize the impact it's having on children and families, so that by recognizing the problem, we can start to take steps to address it. So in the chat box, there should be a link you can click on, fill in your information, and it'll automatically send a message to your policymakers, encouraging them to move forward on current resolutions in both Congress and the Ohio legislature to declare racism a public health crisis. So that's your easy ask for today. We'll be in touch as we have more action steps around advancing the profession, but thank you again for joining us. We're so appreciative of your time, and we look forward to advancing this work with you.